So let's take a look at Europe. A lot of times we like to do little case studies, whether through lecture or videos or readings, things like that. We want to have specific things that we can pull from to use as examples on the AP exam. So here we go. Europe, 1800 to 1920. What stage of the demographic transition model would Europe have been in at this point? 1800 to 1920. Crude death rate is dropping, population is soaring. So what stage is this? Stage number 2. So what this was, Europe was a source region for migrants. People were leaving. And I always call this the safety valve, kind of air quotes, safety valve, because it's like a pressure release valve. As you get closer and closer and closer to your carrying capacity, that's putting more and more pressure to produce enough food and all this kind of stuff, you need to have a pressure release valve. And migration is just that. It's a pressure release valve. And that sounds really callous because we're talking about actual human beings and things like that. But that's essentially what this is that outmigration serves to bring the pressure down, give a greater gap between the total number of people and whatever the carrying capacity is. And so outmigration serves that point. So we see that a lot in stage 2 regions and countries, and Europe, in this case, was certainly in stage 2. So we see net outmigration, more emigration than immigration. And there are other factors as well. Things like, the Irish potato famine would have served to drive people away. Economic downturns in Europe, as well as job opportunities in the United States. Push factors pushing people away from Europe, pull factors bringing people to the United States. Religious persecution would have pushed people away. Political instability would have pushed people away. And so in this case, we're looking at why were people leaving Europe at this time? And there's a lot of different reasons. Agricultural reasons, political reasons, and certainly demographic reasons. And that's what the migration transition model is all about, is looking at the demographics that cause certain migration patterns. So now, fast forward, from 1960 to 2000, there's more in-migration. And to a certain extent, we can extend this beyond 2000 up to now, because this applies to Europe even to this day. The crude birth rate and crude death rate are very, very low. Life expectancy is very, very long. So there's a very large elderly population, what we call the grain of Europe. And so there's a lot of people that moved into Europe from other parts of the world, particularly from former colonies. So make that note out to the side, that a lot of colonies, people were moving back to the former colonial powers. Even after the end of colonialism, after World War II, we saw a lot of people making moves back to the former European colonial powers. And we'll talk about why that is in political geography. But a lot of these guest workers came from areas that had been former colonies. So here's the definition of what a guest worker is. A legal immigrant, sorry, that kind of ran together. I want to make sure it's not illegal. A legal immigrant who has a work visa, usually a short-term work visa. Typically seen in more developed countries of Northern and Western Europe, where migrants usually come from Southern and Eastern Europe and from North Africa in search of higher paying jobs. Again, this is a product of the migration transition model, because Europe is now a destination region for many migrants. And to a certain extent, we can apply this to contemporary problems. When we look at the Syrian refugee crisis, so many Syrians were walking through Eastern Europe to get to Western Europe. And we could say, well, why? Why? I mean, they're getting further away from Syria, yes, but why continue walking through Eastern Europe to get to Western Europe? And it's so complex to try and pinpoint just a single thing. So we're not going to try and do that. But would this be a contributing factor? Absolutely it would. And so there's other elements that we talked about here. Germany, being a stage 5 country, was in desperate need of workers, so took in huge amounts of Syrian refugees. That's an example of the labor shortage that was there, as well as the fact that there were labor surpluses in areas. Now, we're not talking, no longer are we talking about the Syrian refugee crisis, uh, because that was a forced migration rather than a voluntary one. And so in this case study of Europe, they're largely saying that it was a voluntary outmigration of people looking for better paying jobs, economic driven by economics, and there's a labor surplus in North Africa, because what stage was North Africa in? The countries of North Africa were in stage 2. They were approaching, if not over, their carrying capacity. So where are they going to go? Well, they're going to go to the places where they're far below their carrying capacity, where there are a lot of available jobs in need of workers and working age people, especially with those late 4 and early stage 5 countries. And so really this is just a snapshot of what had happened in Europe over a course of about 200 years. And so to try and narrow that down to just 5 minutes in a lecture is really, really difficult, but hopefully we'd be able to use this if we ever had to provide examples about migration. Now, as far as U.S. immigration is concerned, there's 3 major phases that we need to be familiar with. First phase was during the time of the American colonies, and this was largely based on European settlement, which was mainly British, but to be clear, there's also some French and Spanish colonization of the areas that were controlled by the United States at that time, as well as we have to mention the African slaves who were brought over as part of a forced migration from Africa to not only to the American South, but also to the Caribbean and to South America as well. But in this case, we're just looking at the United States. The second major phase started in kind of the mid-1800s, and as these countries moved through the demographic transition model, as they moved through the migration transition model, we see outmigration from each of these areas. So Western Europe, first region to go through the demographic transition, we saw outmigration from there. Northern Europe, later, outmigration from Northern Europe. Then the beginning of the 20th century, so right around the turn of the 20th century, that is the 1900s, we started to see Southern and Eastern Europe as that industrial technology diffused there, as they entered stage 2 of the demographic transition. And now the second half of the 20th century, we've seen a lot more from Latin America and Asia. Remember, those are 2 of our major migration streams even now, largely because of the population growth that's been taking place. Those countries, stage 2, stage 3 of the demographic transition, rapid population growth, and they need that pressure release valve. And so where are many of them going to go? Well, they're going to go where perhaps jobs are available, perhaps where there might be some pull factors of chain migration, economics, better paying jobs, all these different things, many of which bring them to the United States. Now, there are periods of decline as well. And we're going to look at this here in just a minute, because you can visually see the decline in immigration associated with 2 major things. Economic downturns, like we see there, the 1893 Depression, the Great Depression, as well as wars. So make sure that you know the times that we see decline in immigration numbers associated with 2 things: war and economic downturns. So during each of these, the U.S. Civil War, the 1893 Depression, World War I, Great Depression, World War II, all these, we saw huge declines in the number of people coming into the United States. All right, so let's take a look at just one of those phases. In this case, looking at late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, of Northern Europeans migrating to the United States. In this case, it was Nordic migration to the U.S. So in this case, we're talking about Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark to the United States. And this is a link to a website, and you can actually go there. It's time-lapse, so you can click play and see the shapes change and things like that. Let's ask the questions that we always ask. First off, what type of map are we looking at? And at what scale are we looking at? Dora's back. Hopefully you said that this was a graduated symbol map, because notice the circles vary in size. And then we also said subnational units or state units would be fine for the United States. Now, I want to draw your attention to the northern border states because, yeah, New York and California have very large Nordic populations, uh, but we kind of expect that because they just have large populations in general. So, relatively speaking, the northern border states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Idaho, uh, they don't have as big a population. So, why do they have such a large northern European population? And this was largely driven by chain migration, especially to Minnesota and Wisconsin. Those areas, very much driven by chain migration. Previous Northern Europeans, Norwegians, Swedes, Finns, Danes, moved to these areas, and so people moved to those areas. And part of the reason why they moved to this part of the country was because it was relatively sparsely inhabited. There weren't a lot of people living here at the time. And so many Northern Europeans moved to this area to avoid the persecution that many immigrants have faced as they came to the United States. And there's a lot of documented examples of that. But many Northern Europeans avoided that by moving to areas that were relatively sparsely inhabited. And so kind of a counterexample to the laws of migration, where if you're going to move a long distance, you're going to move to a big city. But in this case, they were moving to places where they knew people, so chain migration. And we can actually still see the legacy of this today because there is a football team from Minnesota that shares a little bit its recognition to the large-scale Northern European migration that came to that area. The Minnesota Vikings are a great example of recognizing the cultural heritage of people in that area. And we're going to talk about that a lot because I like to include a lot of those little pop culture references that are like, I never really thought about that, but it makes sense. Well, this is part of the reason why this makes sense. Because so many Northern Europeans moved here, and so it's a little nod to the cultural heritage and the history of Northern Europe. So a couple different examples. This is actually from a released FRQ, so I'm not going to go over this a whole lot, but there's a lot of information here about different historical examples that would have served as push and pull factors. So I want you to go through and kind of identify ones that you are familiar with, that if this were an FRQ, because it was an FRQ, if you had been writing this, which ones would you have been really confident about? So maybe, put a circle around the ones that you would have been most confident about, and maybe put a question mark next to the events or the topics that you're a little less confident about, that maybe you'd want to do a little extra research on, looking into. Because these are the types of things that students had to write on in the past, so these are the types of things that we as students might have to write on in the future. It won't be the exact same, but there are some similarities in different areas of the world. So I want you to take a look at this as to why different areas of the world migrated to the United States. So let's take a look at this graph, because this shows migration into the United States, and we can see all of the different phases that we were just talking about. We can also see a lot of our different the events that we mentioned, the wars and economic downturns. We can see those here as well. Now, a little note on reading this graph, because you will have to read and annotate it and mark it up for our study guide packet. It's a layered graph, so each layer kind of stacks on top of one another. All right. So the green at the bottom, and then you can see the yellow, orange, blue, red, purple. On top of it, they're stacked on top of one another. So that's an important note to read as well, that the layers below don't necessarily impact the layers above. So just because there's a giant spike in one of the lower levels doesn't necessarily mean that that giant spike will be replicated on the upper levels as well. And it could be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So let's go ahead and take a look at this, because you can see the dip in immigration around 1860, right around the U.S. Civil War. you can see kind of the progression over time of different periods. Now, you can also see the dips: World War I, Great Depression, World War II. You can see all of those. Now, I want to draw your attention to the giant spike that's over to the right, because you can see it's kind of like right around the 1990s. And I want to tell you why that spike is there. And to do that, let's look at a different image. So now we can see what that spike is. The spike is labeled as the IRCA legalization. Now, to be very clear, on the last slide, it looks like there was a huge spike in immigration into the United States during like the late 80s into the 90s. But what this shows us is there wasn't a huge spike, and that big spike is actually due to a piece of legislation, the IRCA, which stands for, and you are absolutely going to want to jot this down, take some notes on this, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. That is Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. And essentially what it did was an attempt to try and control and deter illegal immigration into the United States by legalizing undocumented immigrants who had been living in the United States for a lengthy time, continuously in the United States since 1982, as well as legalizing certain agricultural workers, imposing sanctions, rules against or penalties for employers who knowingly hired undocumented workers, and increased enforcement at U.S. borders. That's what the IRCA did. So really, we didn't see a huge spike in people that came in during the late 80s into the 90s. Instead, what we saw is a huge increase in the recognition of people who were already here who weren't documented. So it was the documenting of immigrants who had come at some point and just had been continuously living in the United States since 1982, and now we're documented. And so that was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. And that's something that I think is a contemporary topic as well, because this is something that is still going on. The discussion of illegal immigrants and, what's the best way to address the flow of migrants into the United States, both legal and illegal. And so that's something that's still going on, but it's something that the U.S. has addressed in the past with the IRCA. And so that's an important note to make. So this next image, and we'll move kind of quickly because this lecture has been going rather long, looks at migration to Mexico. And I want to draw your attention to the bottom left, because essentially what they've seen is that during two separate 5-year periods, we've seen changes in migration between the U.S. and Mexico. Between 1995 and 2000, we saw net migration from Mexico to the United States to the tune of 2.27 million people coming into the United States. But from 2005 to 2010, we actually saw net out migration from the United States to Mexico. Just 20,000 people, but still, that's net out migration from the United States. And so, is this a reflection of the level of development between these two countries? Because the kind of interesting thing is, not so much a reflection of the United States, but certainly a reflection of Mexico. Mexico has become much more developed over the last 15, 20 years. And as a result, do we see changes in migration as countries become more developed? And the answer is unequivocally yes. And so this is something to consider, and maybe not even specifically for Mexico, but for really any country. As countries become more developed, are we going to see changes in migration patterns? And the answer is absolutely yes. And so how is that going to impact us here in the United States? How is that going to impact people in other countries? And so that's something to really kind of keep in mind. All right, this is the last slide for tonight. I know we've been going long, so thank you for bearing with me, but give me two or three more minutes and we'll be finished. This map was actually on the AP exam, which is the whole reason why I asked, what type of map is it? What scale are we analyzing? Because we might actually have to do that on the AP exam. And so when we look at this, this is a choropleth map county scale, looking at internal U.S. migration, the years 2000 2006. Now, its choropleth map only has two classes. It has net in migration and net out migration. And students were asked to identify regions that had net in migration and net out migration. So that's what I'm going to ask you guys to do, and we're going to discuss this in class tomorrow. So brainstorm your answers. Then once you brainstorm, circle the one or two that you feel most confident would have gotten you the points for both in migration and out migration. So real quick, brainstorm your answers for regions with net in migration. Brainstorm as many as you can, then circle the one or two that you feel most confident on. Now, brainstorm the regions with net out migration. And then circle those one or two that you feel most confident on, and you're going to bring those to class, and we're going to discuss that in class as part of our warm-up tomorrow. Have a wonderful night, everyone. I'll see you in class. Have a good one.